The hammer came down with a sound like a gunshot. Out on the courthouse steps, it was the sound of a life ending. Or at least, the life they knew. Every other person sold into a debt contract that morning had begged. They'd wept. They'd collapsed. But Zuri just stood there, perfectly still. Her hands were folded, her face a mask, watching a man named Clayton Johnson count out his money. Clayton was a man who fed on broken spirits. He expected tears. He expected a woman on her knees. Instead, he got a woman who met his gaze and held it. His jaw tightened. This wasn't part of the show. "You got something to say, girl?" he asked. He stepped closer, crowding her, trying to make her small. It didn't work. "No, sir," she said, her voice as steady as a rock. Nothing at all. But there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't read. It wasn't defiance, it was knowledge. It was like she could see right through him, down to the rot in his soul, and it made him uneasy. What Clayton didn't know was that Zuri wasn't just another field hand. He didn't know that she'd grown up learning languages people like him assumed she could never understand. Spanish, French, the languages of backroom deals and secret plans. He couldn't see the thin, sharp blade strapped to her ribs beneath her worn dress. A blade she hoped she would never have to use. And neither of them knew that this sale, on these courthouse steps, was not an ending. It was a spark, and it was about to ignite an inferno, because Zuri carried secrets that could burn his entire world to the ground. And Clayton wielded a cruelty that had destroyed every single person who had ever dared to cross him. One of them had been underestimated her entire life. The other had never met a soul he couldn't break. The only question was, which one of them was walking into a trap? The wagon wheels groaned, carving deep ruts in the dusty trail. Clayton Johnson drove Zuri toward his ranch, a place that was less a home and more a prison camp. She sat in the back, her hands bound with coarse rope that bit into her wrists. She didn't complain. She didn't ask for water as the sun beat down. She just watched. She watched the landscape change from scattered buildings to endless stretches of scrubland. She watched every turn in the road, every landmark. Clayton glanced back at her, his eyes narrowed, catching her reflection in the wagon's metal rim. Most of them were crying by now, broken. This one was memorizing the route. "You planning to run?" he asked, yanking the reins harder than he needed to. "No, sir," Zuri replied, her voice flat. "Wouldn't get far." Her answer bothered him. It wasn't fearful, it was practical. It was the answer of someone who had already considered escape, weighed the odds, and dismissed it as a poor strategy. Not impossible, just inefficient. The ranch came into view over a small hill. 3 long, grim buildings arranged around a dusty courtyard. Corrals stretched out in every direction like skeletal fingers. Zuri's eyes swept the compound. She counted. 27 people. Moving too fast. Too purposeful. Their shoulders were hunched. Their eyes were on the ground. It was the specific rhythm of fear. And she recognized it instantly. Clayton brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. "Get out!" Zuri stood, her legs stiff. As her feet hit the dirt, the work stopped. Every one of those 27 people turned to watch her. Their faces held a grim mix of pity and relief. Relief that it was her, and not them. Clayton grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. "Listen careful," he snarled. "You belong to me now. You eat when I say, you sleep where I tell you, you work until I'm satisfied." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low threat. "Step out of line once, and you'll wish you were never born." Zuri met his eyes. She didn't flinch. His grip tightened. "I understand," she said. "Do you?" He leaned even closer, his breath hot and sour against her face. "I got 3 ranches. Workers who don't follow orders. They tend to disappear between 'em. Accidents happen all the time out here." The threat hung in the air, thick as smoke. Zuri felt the cold steel of the blade against her skin. It would be so easy, but her expression never changed. "Where would you like me to start working, sir?" she asked. Clayton stared, searching for the crack in her composure. The fear, the weakness. He found nothing. Finally, he let her go, shoving her away. He pointed a thumb toward a small, dilapidated building at the edge of the compound. "Quarters are over there. Work starts before dawn." He turned to walk away, then stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "And girl," he said, his voice laced with venom, "don't make me regret buying you." As Zuri watched him stalk off toward the main house, a single thought echoed in her mind. He had no idea how much he was going to regret it. The quarters smelled of sweat and fear, and hopelessness. 12 narrow bunks lined the walls, crammed so close you could barely walk between them. Zuri counted the occupants. 11 others. 8 men, 2 women, and a boy, Miguel, who couldn't have been more than 15. They all looked up as she entered, their faces hollow. "New meat," one of the men muttered. His hands were a roadmap of scars. "Clayton's been busy this month." A woman with kind, tired eyes approached her cautiously. Her name was Rosa. "Hablas español?" she whispered. Zuri shook her head, keeping her face a careful blank. She understood every word. But knowledge was a weapon, and you never showed your weapons until you were ready to strike. The woman's shoulders sagged. "Don't matter anyway," Rosa said in broken English. "He don't like us talking, not in any language he can't understand." "How long have you been here?" Zuri asked, her voice quiet. She sat on the only empty bunk, the straw mattress rustling beneath her. 2 years, Rosa replied, her voice barely a whisper. "Debt keeps growing. Clayton says we eat too much, use too many supplies. The number never goes down." The scarred man laughed, a bitter rattling sound. "The number ain't supposed to go down, girl. That's the point. We work until we die, or until we can't work no more." He drew a finger across his throat. "Then we disappear." Zuri took it all in. 12 people here. She'd counted 27 outside. That meant 15 others were housed somewhere else. Probably at the other 2 ranches Clayton had mentioned, the ones people disappeared between. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Cattle mostly," the boy Miguel whispered. "But Clayton's got other business too. Men come at night. Wagons. We load them. We don't ask questions." Rosa shot the boy a sharp warning look. "Miguel, calate." The boy fell silent. But it was too late. The pieces were starting to click into place. This was more than a ranch. It was a hub, a criminal enterprise hiding in plain sight. A sharp bell rang outside, a sound that made everyone flinch. "Dinner," Rosa said, standing wearily. "We get 1 meal, then sleep. Work starts in 4 hours." They filed out toward a crude outdoor kitchen. Zuri watched how they moved, heads down, shoulders hunched, never ever making eye contact with the 3 armed men standing guard. These weren't overseers. They were prison guards. The food was a thin, watery soup and a hunk of stale bread. Zuri ate slowly, listening. The conversations were fragments, spoken in hushed tones. Mostly English. But she caught words in Spanish. And a few snippets of something else. French. Then, a tall guard with a rifle strolled past their table. One of the workers, who had been speaking in rapid Spanish, immediately switched to broken English mid-sentence. The guard smiled, satisfied, and moved on. But Zuri had heard enough. Just a few words, but they were enough to turn her blood to ice. Tomorrow night. Clayton was expecting visitors. Important visitors. And something was going to happen. Something that would change everything for every single person trapped on this ranch. And it was going to be drenched in blood. The scream ripped through the night. It was high-pitched, desperate, and it came from the main house. Zuri sat bolt upright on her bunk, her heart hammering. The sound came again, a raw shriek of agony. Around her, the other workers stirred. They were afraid, but nobody moved. They had learned long ago not to get involved in the affairs of the main house. "Clayton's daughter," Rosa whispered from the next bunk, her voice tight with fear. "She gets the fever sometimes. Been sick for months." Another scream, followed by Clayton's voice, roaring in anger and frustration. Even through the thin walls, Zuri could hear the panic in his words. "Doctor comes from town sometimes," Miguel added, his voice trembling in the dark. "But he don't help much. Says there ain't nothing more he can do." Zuri lay back down, but her mind was racing. Fever, sickness, a doctor who couldn't help. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had birthed half the children in their parish and healed the other half, a woman who knew the secrets of the earth, the language of herbs and roots. That knowledge was still inside her, stored away, waiting. The crying from the main house went on for another hour before finally fading into exhausted whimpers. Dawn broke gray and cold. Clayton emerged from his house looking like a ghost. He looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes wild with desperation. His usual cruelty was gone, replaced by something far more volatile. He stalked through the compound like a caged wolf, barking orders. He struck one worker for moving too slowly. He kicked another just for looking at him. Fear in the camp turned to terror. An unstable king was more dangerous than a cruel one. Around midday, a wagon pulled up. A thin man in a black suit hurried into the main house with a medical bag. The doctor. He came out 20 minutes later, shaking his head. Zuri was pretending to fix a fence post nearby, close enough to hear. "The temperature is too high, Mr. Johnson," the doctor said, his voice low and defeated. "The infection has spread. I can give her laudanum for the pain, but beyond that—" He shrugged, a gesture of complete helplessness. Clayton grabbed the front of the doctor's shirt, his knuckles white. "There has to be something. More medicine. A specialist from back east." "Mr. Johnson, I understand," the doctor stammered. "But sometimes we must accept that a battle cannot be won. It would be better to make her comfortable, in her final days." The sound Clayton made was a strangled sob, half rage, half despair. He shoved the doctor away so hard the man stumbled backward. "Get out," Clayton said, his voice a deadly quiet hiss. "Get out and don't come back." As the doctor's wagon rattled away, Clayton stood alone on his porch, staring at nothing. And for the first time, Zuri saw past the monster. She saw a father. Terrified. Powerless. Watching his child slip away. It was a crack in his armor. A tiny opening. And it was exactly what she had been waiting for. She waited until the sun began to bleed across the horizon. Clayton had spent the afternoon pacing, a caged animal, his rage a palpable thing that sent workers scattering. The others gave him a wide berth, but Zuri walked straight toward the main house. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, her shadow long in the evening light. "Mr. Johnson," she called out. Her voice was steady, calm. He spun around, his face a mask of fury. "What do you want?" Zuri took a breath. This was it. The gamble that would either get her inside or get her killed. "I might be able to help your daughter." His expression shifted from pure rage to a dangerous, predatory disbelief. "What did you say?" "I have some knowledge," Zuri said, choosing her words carefully. "Of healing. Herbs. My grandmother taught me." For a long, tense moment, Clayton looked like he was going to come down those steps and strike her dead. "You think some slave woman's folk remedies are going to save my daughter when a real doctor can't?" The slur dripped from his tongue like poison. The air crackled between them. But Zuri didn't back down. "I think your daughter is dying," she said, her voice cutting through his pride. "And you are out of options." His hands clenched into fists. He was a man drowning, and she was offering him a frayed piece of rope. He hated her for it. He hated that he needed it. She could see the war in his eyes, his pride against his desperation. "If you're lying to me," he said finally, his voice shaking with barely controlled violence. "If this is a trick, I will make your death last for weeks." "I understand," she said. He stared at her, his eyes searching her face. Then he jerked his head toward the front door. "Come on, then." As she climbed the steps, he added one more threat. "But if I find you've touched anything, if anything goes missing—" The inside of the house was a shock. Heavy wood furniture, thick carpets, portraits of stern-faced ancestors staring down from the walls. This was old money. Blood money. He led her down a long hallway. The child's room was at the end. Zuri smelled it before she even entered. The sour, cloying odor of sickness. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, lay in a massive bed. Her name was Sarah. Her skin was flushed, her breathing a series of short, labored gasps. Zuri went to the bedside. She placed a hand on the child's forehead. The heat was intense, the fever dangerously high. But she had seen worse. More importantly, she recognized the symptoms. She knew this fight. "I need willow bark," she said, turning to Clayton. "And clean water. Lots of it, and honey." Clayton, the man who had threatened to kill her moments before, just nodded and hurried from the room. A desperate father, taking orders from his property. Zuri was alone with the child, and then she heard it. Voices, drifting from another part of the house, from downstairs. Men, speaking in French. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She strained to listen, but the words were too muffled. Clayton returned with the supplies. His eyes lingered on her face. The way he looked at her had changed. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. There was something else there. A flicker of hope. And Zuri realized, with a chill, that saving this child might be just as dangerous as letting her die. She worked through the night. Cool cloths on Sarah's burning forehead. Small, measured doses of willow bark tea, sweetened with honey. Clayton never left the room. He sat in a chair in the corner, a silent, brooding shadow, watching her every move. Just before dawn, the fever broke. Sarah's breathing deepened, becoming even and regular. The flush on her cheeks began to fade. The silence in the room was broken by Clayton's rough voice. "How did you know what to do?" "My grandmother," Zuri said, not looking at him. "She taught me that fever is the body's way of fighting, but sometimes the fire burns too hot. It needs help." He studied her in the growing light. "Where did you learn to speak so well?" he asked. The question was a probe, an attempt to understand the anomaly she presented. "Most of your kind can barely string a sentence together." The casual poison in his words made her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "My family believed education was important." "Your family," he said, skepticism thick in his voice. "And where are they now?" "Dead, mostly," she replied, smoothing Sarah's blanket. "Scattered. That's how I ended up here." It was a half-truth, close enough to be believable. Just then, the little girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for the first time in days. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Clayton was at her side in an instant, his large, rough hand engulfing hers. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." "Who is she?" Sarah asked, her gaze falling on Zuri. Clayton looked at Zuri, and for a second, the mask of the cruel rancher fell away completely. All that was left was a father's raw, overwhelming gratitude. "This is Zuri," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She made you well again." Over the next 3 days, Sarah's recovery was a miracle, and Zuri's status on the ranch changed completely. She was moved from the squalid quarters into a small room in the main house next to Sarah's. She ate her meals in the kitchen, not with the other workers. The house staff, who had once looked at her with fear, now treated her with a strange kind of deference. She was the woman who had saved the boss's daughter. She was untouchable, and it gave her the perfect cover to listen. Clayton's study was directly above the kitchen, the voices carried through the floorboards, and every night the Frenchman came. On the third evening, as Zuri washed dishes, she heard them. Clayton and two others. Their conversation grew heated. "The family's near the river," one voice said in crisp, Parisian French. "They have too much money. We must act quickly." Zuri's hands stilled in the soapy water. Clayton's reply was a low rumble. "Yes, but we must be careful. Last week's fire drew too much attention." Fire. It all clicked into place with horrifying speed. The mysterious wagons, the disappearing people, the debt contracts that never went down. Clayton wasn't just a rancher, he was a predator. He was systematically destroying families, burning their crops, poisoning their livestock, driving them into ruin. And then, when they were desperate, he would swoop in, offer a loan, and take everything they had left, including their freedom. The nightly conversations became her classroom. She learned the full scope of his evil empire, and she learned their next target. "The Rodriguez family will be next," Clayton said one night, his voice cold and clinical. "Their land is perfect for our needs." Zuri memorized every name, every detail, every planned act of terror. But as she gathered her weapons of information, a new danger was growing. Right here, inside the house. Clayton had started watching her. It began subtly, his eyes lingering on her a moment too long. His presence in a room when he had no reason to be there. Then it grew bolder. One evening he cornered her in the hallway outside Sarah's room. He stood too close, blocking her path. "You move differently than the others," he said, his voice low. Zuri kept her face a mask of polite confusion. "I don't understand, Mr. Johnson." "Graceful," he said. His eyes traveled down her body, slow and possessive. "Like you were raised for something more than a field hand. Makes a man wonder what other talents you might be hiding." The threat was unmistakable. "I should check on Sarah," she said, trying to step around him. He moved with her, blocking her again. She could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Sarah's sleeping. She doesn't need you right now." His hand started to move toward her waist. Zuri felt the cold weight of the blade against her ribs. Every muscle in her body tensed. She calculated the angle, the speed, the single swift motion it would take to drive the knife into his throat. But killing him now meant Sarah would die. The fever would return without her care. It meant the Rodriguez family would burn next week with no one to warn them. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice dangerously calm. "Your daughter might wake up." The mention of his daughter seemed to break the spell. He paused, his hand hovering in the air. At that exact moment, footsteps echoed from the front of the house. His associates were here. Clayton dropped his hand and stepped back, his face tight with frustration. "Go tend to Sarah," he growled, "but this conversation isn't finished." As he walked away, Zuri leaned against the wall, her heart pounding like a drum. She had escaped. This time. But his desire was escalating. Soon, it would overwhelm what little caution he had left, and she would be forced to make an impossible choice. From the study below, the familiar sound of French began to drift up through the floorboards. They were finalizing the plans. Zuri knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her time was running out. 3 nights later, he found her. She was in the kitchen, long after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, preparing Sarah's medicine for the morning. His shadow fell across the doorway, blocking her only escape. The smell of whiskey was stronger this time. His shirt was unbuttoned, his eyes glazed with a mixture of lust and liquor. Working late? He slurred. It wasn't a question. Sarah's medicine needs to be prepared fresh, Zuri said, her hands never stopping their work of grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle. The fever could return. He moved into the kitchen, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch was as loud as a gunshot in the silent house. Sarah's fine, he said, his voice rough. You're avoiding me. I am doing my job, Mr. Johnson. Your job, he laughed, a humorless, ugly sound. Your job is whatever I say it is, and right now, I'm thinking your talents are being wasted. He stepped closer. Zuri felt the handle of the blade, cool and solid against her skin. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Kill him now, and Sarah relapses. The Rodriguez family burns. Dozens more fall into his trap. But let this happen. Sacrifice herself for the mission. Would she even survive to see it through? His hand landed on her shoulder, his fingers tracing a path down her arm. You're not like the others, he murmured, his breath hot against her neck. So refined, educated, makes a man curious. Her hand closed around the hilt of the blade, hidden in the folds of her dress. One quick thrust, upward, between the ribs, into the heart. It would be over. The thought was a dizzying rush of power. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. This is not appropriate. His other hand snaked around her waist, pulling her back against him. Appropriate? He grunted, his intention sickeningly clear. I own you, girl. I can do whatever I want with my property. The blade was in her palm now. His breath grew heavier, his hands more bold. All she had to do was turn. One smooth, fluid motion. The world seemed to slow down. She could feel the rough fabric of his shirt, smell the sour whiskey on his breath. She pictured the arc of the blade, and then something shifted. He suddenly stiffened. He let go of her and stumbled back, his face twisting not with lust, but with disgust. Christ, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. What am I thinking? He looked at her, but it was like he was seeing her for the first time. Not as an object of desire, but as what he truly believed she was. You're just a damn slave, he spat, the words a shield for his own shame. Dark as the devil. The very racism that had driven him to buy her, to enslave her, to see her as less than human, had just saved her from him. He backed toward the door, shaking his head as if waking from a nightmare. Get back to your quarters, he ordered, his voice harsh with self-loathing, and stay away from me unless Sarah needs you. The kitchen door slammed shut. Zuri stood frozen, the blade still clenched in her trembling hand. She had survived. But the bitter irony of it burned like acid in her throat. She knew then that she couldn't wait any longer. She had to act, and she had to act now. The opportunity came 2 days later. Clayton announced he was riding to his northern ranch. A cattle transfer, he said. He'd be gone for at least a day. As he prepared to leave, Zuri watched from Sarah's window. She saw him giving instructions to one of his French associates. Then she saw him hand the man a sealed envelope. This letter for Henry must leave tonight, Clayton said, his voice carrying on the morning air. Everything must be ready for tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. Zuri's blood ran cold. The Rodriguez attack wasn't next week. It was tomorrow. The timeline had just been cut in half. As soon as Clayton's wagon was a speck of dust on the horizon, Zuri made her move. She saw the associate place the letter on the desk in Clayton's study. She waited. Then she found the house servant tasked with taking the mail to town. A nervous, twitchy man who lived in fear of Clayton. Mr. Johnson asked me to double-check that letter before you leave, she said, her voice calm and authoritative. He was concerned about an error in the address. The servant, terrified of making a mistake that would earn him a beating, handed over the envelope without a second thought. In the kitchen, Zuri carefully steamed it open over a kettle. The contents confirmed her worst fears. It was written in French. Henri and his men were to surround the Rodriguez property at midnight. Burn the barn first to draw them out. If they resisted, burn the house. Poison any livestock that survived. And the final instruction was chilling. Ensure no witnesses remained. Zuri's hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She resealed the letter and returned it to the servant. She had less than 18 hours. She couldn't do it alone. She needed help. And the only people she could trust were the very people Clayton had enslaved. That evening, at the meager dinner, Zuri sat next to Rosa and Miguel. When the guards weren't looking, she leaned close to Rosa. And she spoke in perfect, fluent Spanish. Necesito tu ayuda. La familia Rodriguez está en peligro. I need your help. The Rodriguez family is in danger. Rosa nearly dropped her bowl. Her eyes went wide with shock. She stared at Zuri as if seeing a ghost. How? Rosa whispered, her voice trembling. How do you know this? I have been listening, Zuri said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. They are going to burn their ranch, tomorrow night. For the next hour, they planned, whispering in Spanish, using Miguel as a lookout. It turned out Rosa had a cousin, Carlos, who worked on the neighboring Hernandez ranch. The Hernandez family traded with the Rodriguez family. Miguel knew the back trails that connected the properties, trails the guards didn't watch. It was a long shot, a dangerous, desperate plan. But just as they were finalizing the details, a shadow fell over their table. It was one of the guards. His eyes were narrowed with suspicion. You three been talking an awful lot tonight, he said, his voice a slow drawl. What's so important? The air went still. Rosa and Miguel froze, their faces pale with terror. They both looked to Zuri. Their lives were in her hands. Zuri looked up at the guard, her expression one of quiet sadness. She didn't miss a beat. Rosa was telling us about her sick child back home, she said, her voice soft. And Miguel, he lost his mother to the same fever that nearly took Sarah. She let the name hang in the air. Sarah, the boss's daughter, her miracle cure. The guard's expression softened. Just a fraction, but it was enough. Well, keep it quiet, he grumbled, and moved on. Rosa let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked at Zuri with a new kind of respect. Awe. The plan was back on. Within the hour, Miguel slipped out of the compound under the cover of darkness. He was a ghost in the night, running the trails he knew like the back of his hand. He was going to find Carlos. A chain of communication was being forged in secret, a network of the oppressed, right under the nose of their oppressor. But as Zuri lay on her bunk that night, she knew a warning wasn't enough. Clayton had a whole network. 3 ranches, dozens of men. Stopping one attack wouldn't stop him. It would only make him more careful, more brutal. She turned to Rosa in the darkness. We need more than a warning, she whispered. We need evidence. We need to destroy him. Rosa's eyes hardened in the gloom. She understood. This wasn't about saving one family anymore. This was about burning the entire empire to the ground. News travels fast when freedom is on the line. The next morning, the ranch was buzzing. Not with fear, but with a new, dangerous energy. Hope. Whispers passed from worker to worker in Spanish. Miguel had made it. His cousin Carlos had ridden like the wind. The Hernandez ranch had been warned before sunrise. And the families weren't running. They were fighting back. Riders were spreading out across the territory, warning not just the Rodriguez family, but the Morales, the Santos, the Martinez, all the names Zuri had memorized from the late-night conversations. The Rodriguez family had sent word to the territorial marshal. The Hernandez and Santos families were gathering armed men, not to defend, but to attack, to set a trap. By noon, the whispers had become a flood of information. Clayton's men had walked right into it. Henri and 3 others were captured as they tried to light the Rodriguez barn on fire. They were in the custody of the marshal. And they were talking. They gave up the locations of Clayton's other ranches. They gave up a list of his associates. But Henri, in exchange for a lighter sentence, gave up the crown jewel, the location of Clayton's personal safe, and the combination. Rosa found Zuri by the corral as the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors of fire and blood. "Los federales están en camino," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "The federal marshals are coming." "But Clayton will be back tomorrow morning," she added. "His men here. They don't know what's happened yet." Zuri nodded. She looked at the guards patrolling the compound, oblivious. They were ghosts, watching over a criminal empire that was already dead. Tomorrow would be the reckoning. But Zuri had one last task. Inside that safe were years of evidence. Ledgers, letters, contracts, the paper trail of Clayton's reign of terror. Tonight, while the guards were blind and Clayton was away, she was going to get it. She would be the one to hand the marshals the nails for his coffin. The wagon crested the hill just as the sun hit its peak. Zuri watched from Sarah's window. She saw the exact moment Clayton Johnson's world shattered. His confident expression melted into confusion. Then confusion curdled into raw terror. His ranch was surrounded. Federal marshals on horseback formed a ring of steel around the compound. Their badges glinted in the noon sun. His guards were already on their knees in the dirt, their hands bound, their weapons piled in a heap. Zuri had spent the night in his study. The combination Henri provided had worked perfectly. The evidence she'd found was more damning than she could have imagined. Letters, in French and English, detailing every arson, every fraudulent contract. A network of corruption that stretched across 3 territories. Clayton tried to turn his wagon, to whip his horses into a desperate gallop. But it was too late. The trap had closed. Mounted marshals blocked his path. They dragged him from the driver's seat and threw him to the ground. Zuri walked out of the main house and stood on the porch as they forced him to his knees. "Clayton Johnson," the lead marshal announced, his voice booming across the silent courtyard. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, arson, fraud, and human trafficking." Clayton's face was ashen. His eyes darted around, taking in the ruin of his empire. Then his gaze landed on Zuri, and in his eyes, she saw the dawning, horrified comprehension. "You," he breathed, the word barely a whisper. "You did this." Zuri looked down at the man who had owned her, threatened her, tried to break her, and she felt nothing but cold, clean satisfaction. "No," she said, her voice clear and calm. "You did this to yourself. I just made sure everyone knew about it." The marshal holding Clayton looked from him to Zuri, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This woman provided crucial intelligence, Johnson," he said. "Turns out, you bought a woman who spoke fluent French. Every plan you made, every secret you shared with your associates, she heard it all, and she passed it on." Clayton struggled against the hands that held him, his face twisting into a mask of pure, impotent rage. "She's a slave, a piece of property. You can't take the word of a damn slave over a white man." The marshal's grin vanished. "Actually," he said, his voice turning to ice, "we're not taking anyone's word. We have your own documents, in your own handwriting. We have your man Henry's full confession. We have testimony from a dozen families you destroyed. Your race isn't a shield from justice, Johnson. Not anymore." As they hauled him away, other agents began freeing the workers. The debt contracts were declared null and void. Rosa wept as she was reunited with 2 small children who had been held at the northern ranch. Miguel found his sister. Families torn apart by Clayton's greed were made whole again. Zuri stayed on the porch, watching the prison wagon disappear down the dusty trail. The blade she had carried for so long, the weight that had been a constant presence against her ribs, suddenly felt lighter. It was a weapon she had never needed to use. Her mind had been the sharper weapon all along. Sarah appeared at her side, her face bright and healthy, confused by all the commotion. "What's happening, Zuri? Where is Daddy going?" Zuri knelt down, meeting the little girl's eyes. "Your father made some very bad choices, Sarah," she said gently. "He hurt a lot of people. Now he has to face the consequences." She looked out at the faces of the freed workers, at the tears of joy, at the hope of a new beginning. "But you're safe now," she said to the child. "And all the people he hurt are finally free." The territorial court sentenced Clayton Johnson to 25 years in federal prison. His ranches were seized and sold, the money used to compensate the families he had ruined. Zuri, who had walked onto that ranch as property, walked away a free woman. Justice, she thought, could be slow. It could take years of pain and suffering. But when it finally arrives, it is worth the wait. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where the underestimated become the unforgettable. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story.